Welcome to This Explainer. Today we are diving into a genuinely wild piece of history. We're looking at the life of Saint Agnes. She was a young girl famously executed for refusing to renounce Christ. But, more than just the actual historical facts of her martyrdom, we're really going to explore how her incredibly short life was actively transformed into a massive legendary narrative by early Christian authors. So this isn't just a story about a saint. It's honestly a masterclass in storytelling and how powerful figures molded a single narrative to shape an entire society.
So, right off the bat, we've got to ask, how on earth did a 13-year-old become the ultimate hero of the Roman Empire? Investigating that answer reveals a really fascinating reality about how historical mythology is actually constructed. It wasn't an accident, right? And it wasn't just organic word of mouth that spread like wildfire. It was a highly deliberate, calculated literary campaign by brilliant theological minds who desperately needed a hero for their own specific times and their own agendas.
Here is our roadmap for this explainer. We'll start with a core legend, check out the accounts by Demesis and Ambrose, look at Prudentius and the Gesta, and finally wrap up with her lasting legacy. Let's jump in.
Section 1. The core legend. So, what actually happened before all the myth-making started?
At the absolute historical bedrock, here is what we know for sure. Agnes was a real 12 or 13-year-old Roman noblewoman who died during the Great Persecution. She was executed somewhere between 295 and 305 CE, specifically for refusing to renounce her Christian faith. And because her cult flourished locally in Rome almost immediately after she died, she really stood at the threshold of this brand new Christian epic. But here's the catch. Because she died so incredibly young and left literally no writings of her own behind, she was essentially a total blank canvas. She didn't have anyone to initially write her true story down.
Moving on to Section 2. Damasus and the Fire. This is where her story begins to shift.
Take a look at how incredibly fast this narrative evolves. It is just a rapid succession of texts that actively rewrite her history. In the late 4th century, we get Pope Damasus and Ambrose of Milan. Then, by the early 5th century, Prudentius steps in, followed super closely by the Gesta. So, within about a single century, her story is drafted, heavily revised, and essentially set in stone by totally different authors who had very different goals.
Pope Damasus brings in our first major plot twist. His short poem claims she was burned at the stake, and that she actually used her miraculously growing hair to protect her modesty from the crowd. He writes that she leaped right from her nurse's lap to face her persecutors. Now, why write it exactly like this? Well, Damasus was trying to establish his own papal authority in Rome against rival factions. He really needed to associate himself with the quintessential local Roman martyr to prove his orthodoxy to the everyday people.
All right, Section 3. Ambrose, the defiant martyr.
Now, Ambrose of Milan takes one look at Damasus's version and completely flips the script. He literally changes her method of execution from Damasus's passive burning at the stake to an active, demanding beheading by sword. Why the dramatic change? Because Ambrose was pushing for virgin asceticism. He wanted the women of his congregation to embrace strict piety and intense faith. He couldn't really use a passive victim for that message. He needed a bold, unyielding hero who was an active participant in her own martyrdom.
Just feel the raw, intense energy in those words. Ambrose transforms Agnes into this fierce, incredibly vocal figure who practically demands the executioner's sword just to extinguish the unholy flames of paganism. I mean, imagine an entire church choir reciting this hymn. It absolutely forced Ambrose's wavering congregation to vigorously defend their own faith by speaking the very words of this defiant martyr, kind of reliving her ultimate sacrifice right there in the church.
Next up, Section 4. Prudentius and the Sword. Building on what Ambrose did, things take another turn.
The Iberian poet Prudentius steps in next, and he turns her into this quintessential classic Roman hero. He introduces a highly dramatic execution sequence. This includes that famous legendary element where Agnes is sent to a public brothel. But in a twist that perfectly aligns with classic Roman values of honor and modesty, the entire crowd respectfully averts their eyes. Prudentius is basically writing an epic here. He's making Agnes a safe, culturally acceptable model for aristocratic Roman women who are in the middle of transitioning from traditional Roman values over to Christianity.
It gets pretty extreme here, honestly. This brilliantly illustrates the poetic lengths Prudentius goes to.
He actually has Agnes frame her execution by the sword as a literal, passionate consummation of her marriage to Christ. It's an intensely dramatic and, frankly, highly sexualized metaphor. For Prudentius, her death isn't just a basic execution. It's a triumphant, spiritual union that she actively craves in order to protect her eternal innocence.
Section 5. The Gesta and the Brothel. Now we get to the massive civic drama.
By the time we hit the Gesta, which is a 5th century text, her story has totally snowballed. The Gesta expands the cast of characters significantly. In this version, a Roman prefect actually tries to save her, and Agnes even resurrects his dead son. As you can imagine, this causes the pagan mob to totally panic. She survives being burned at the stake through the sheer power of her words, which eventually forces a Roman deputy to silence her with a sword to the throat. This specific text was designed from the ground up to completely discredit the old traditional Roman religion.
If you take away just one thing from this entire explainer, this is it right here. This perfectly captures how early authors actively rewrote the details of her death to serve their own specific motives. Now, they all utilize the core historical fact that she was executed for refusing to renounce Christ, but they totally molded the physical details of her death to fit their specific needs. Damasus used fire for papal authority, Ambrose used beheading for asceticism, Prudentius used the sword to create a classical hero, and the Gesta used a stab to the throat to defeat paganism.
Finally, Section 6, a lasting legacy. Let's look at how this intense 4th century literary battle affected art and culture. Because of these wild, competing narratives, historical art depicts Agnes with a really fascinating mix of visual attributes drawn straight from the conflicting accounts we just analyzed. You'll very often see her with a lamb, which plays on her name and symbolizes purity. But you are also going to see flames from Damas's account and a sword from the defiant narratives of Ambrose and Prudentius. It's wild. Her visual legacy is the stunning, combined composite of centuries of incredibly deliberate storytelling.
So to wrap things up, I want to leave you with this final thought to ponder. She was a real, historical young woman who absolutely gave her life for her beliefs, executed for refusing to renounce Christ. But the Agnes we remember today, she is a masterpiece of literature, theology, and social engineering. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and I really hope it inspires you to always question the layers of history hidden behind the legends we all know so well.